And welcome once again to Flashpoints. I'm Bob Orr. Joining me, as he always does, is Juan Zarate, our national security analyst. Juan, good to see you.
Bob, great to see you.
So we've been talking about Ukraine, and that situation is not getting better. In fact, if anything, it looks like it's going towards a tipping point, perhaps.
Yeah, the diplomatic deal obviously didn't work on the ground. We had talked about, really the proof was whether or not the pro-Russian militants would actually lay down their arms and vacate the buildings that they had occupied, the government buildings, the town halls, security offices. They have not. And what you've seen is an escalation of violence. You've seen a number of confrontations at checkpoints. You've seen the Ukrainians continue to try to use force to dislodge the pro-Russian militias in some of these towns in the east of the country. You've seen the Russians not pull back their troops from the border. And in fact, President Putin saying quite openly that they reserve the right to use force to defend the interests of the Russian-speaking population in eastern Ukraine. So this is devolving, and it's clear that the diplomacy around this has not worked to affect the dynamics on the ground.
So, I mean, it's a crystal ball question, but what happens next? Because it seems like no matter what the West tries to do, Putin thumbs his nose at that and just goes on.
No, I think that's right. I think that's the reality that everyone has to come to grips with. Russia is going to do what's in its interests, and President Putin has frankly articulated this pretty openly. He did it with the annexation of Crimea. He gave that speech, which was pretty open about what his ambitions were and how he viewed Russia in the world. And part of this is the defense of Russian-speaking cultures, in particular in places like Ukraine and Belarus. I mean, that's part of the strategy here. And so he's going to take any opportunity, I think, to influence the situation on the ground, to flex Russia's muscles, and to try to, in some ways, destabilize Kiev as they move toward elections. And I think for the United States and the rest of Europe, the challenge here is how do you help the Ukraine to stabilize itself, get control of what's happening in the east, deter Russia, and then also allay the fears of other countries like the Baltic nations that are very worried about what Russian aggression really means.
Now, President Obama, on his trip to the Far East, said other sanctions are teed up and ready to go. But then he seemed to say, but we're not very confident they'll do much.
Well, I think that last comment, unfortunately, is a reality of these kinds of sanctions. They're not going to have immediate impact, and they're not going to roll back the tanks out of Crimea or pull down the Russian flags over some of these sites. At a certain point, you have to use force to dislodge pro-Russian militants, and you've got to use other means to influence. But what sanctions and financial pressure can do is demonstrate that there are real costs to Russia, short, medium, long term, to continuing their provocations. And I think we've been quite passive, frankly, in launching a financial isolation campaign against Russia that actually hurts. We've been waiting to see what would happen. We've been giving President Putin, frankly, first mover advantage, and we've been very reactive as a result. And so now we've got the question of, well, when do the next sanctions come out? What do they look like? And in some ways, this is dependent on what Russia does. And I think that's the wrong posture if you're going to make these sanctions work.
As we wrap this up, is it even possible, though, to put President Putin in a box? I mean, this is a pretty tough nut.
Well, I think you can long term. I think that there's a distinction between what's happening today, and in particular what happened with Crimea and the annexation, and what's going to happen long term. Long term, you clearly can put him in a box. You can put him in a box by driving to alternate sources of energy away from Russia, and you've seen the Europeans talk about it. You can drive some of the economic isolation with some targeted conduct-based sanctions, which I've written about and talked about. You can move them away diplomatically. You've seen, obviously, their expulsion from the G8, or at least their eschewing from those major fora. And so long term, you can see a real detriment to Russia's economy, to its political standing, to its diplomacy. But in the short term, Russia's on the offense. President Putin's got first mover advantage, and they're making the first moves and calls here.
Obviously, one we have to keep our eye on. Juan, thanks as always.
Constantly. Thank you, Bob.
And thanks to you for watching Flashpoints. I'm Bob Orr. We'll see you next time.